way communities came together in the face of such great challenge carry a timeless message for us all. These are the values which have shaped our country and the Commonwealth. As we hear of division, both at home and abroad, they are the values of which we must never lose sight. For instance,
Diana never granted a single royal warrant during her entire life inside that family. Not one in over 15 years as Princess of Wales. For a woman who redefined what it meant to be a public royal, who broke protocol constantly, who connected with ordinary people in ways the institution had never seen before or since, who could walk into a hospital ward and change how an entire country thought about illness and stigma in a single afternoon. This is a strange, almost uncomfortable omission when you actually stop to look at it. It wasn't because she lacked influence. If anything, her cultural reach in the 1980s and 90s rivaled or exceeded anything Catherine commands today, in an era with far fewer channels for that influence to travel through. It was because the firm, as insiders call it, has always been extremely cautious about which family members are trusted with formal institutional power versus which ones are simply allowed to be popular and visible. On June 30th, 2025, Buckingham Palace put out a statement so dry, so bureaucratic, so easy to scroll past, that most people never even registered what it actually said. It was a few sentences about warrants, about brands, about paperwork. The kind of announcement that usually gets filed under royal trivia and forgotten by lunchtime, the kind of press release that exists mostly to keep a handful of trade publications busy for a day. But buried inside that unremarkable little statement was something that hadn't happened in this family in over a century. King Charles had just given Catherine, Princess of Wales, a power that no Princess of Wales has held in 115 years. Not Diana. Not anyone in between. Just Queen Mary, back in 1910, and now, finally, Catherine.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for being here today. I hope you'll find it interesting and insightful. I'm certainly looking forward to it, and we've got some fantastic speakers.
Sit with that for a second, because it matters more than the palace let on. This wasn't a title. It wasn't a tiara pulled out for a gala. It wasn't a ceremonial nothing designed to keep the tabloids busy for a news cycle before everyone moved on to the next royal outfit. This was the King of England handing his daughter-in-law genuine, tangible authority. The kind that touches money, reputation, and the future direction of the entire institution, at the exact moment his own health has become the most closely watched, most carefully worded subject in the country. And once you start pulling the thread on why this happened now, and why it went to her specifically, you start to see a pattern the palace never officially confirmed but never quite denied either. Before we get into what that power actually is, and why it's so much bigger than it sounds on paper, I want you to stay with me here, because this is one of those stories where the further you go, the stranger the timing gets. There's a version of this update that's genuinely nothing more than a modern institution updating its paperwork. And there's another version, sitting quietly underneath it, that looks a lot more like a king making decisions about legacy while he still has the chance to make them himself. If you've ever wondered how quietly the real decisions get made inside that palace, this is one of the clearest windows we've had in years. And if this is the kind of story you want to see more of, where we take something the palace announced almost in passing and actually sit with what it means, this is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to dig into. So if that's useful to you, sticking around and subscribing means you won't miss where this leads, because I don't think this is where the story ends. So let's start with the plainest possible question. What is a royal warrant, and why would anyone build an entire mystery around something that sounds this ordinary?
He's a great friend of mine. I have a large number of friends. I'm terribly lucky to have so many friends who I think are wonderful and make the whole difference to my life, which is becoming...
Or stitched into the label of a coat, that's a royal warrant at work. It tells the world, quite literally, this business is good enough for the crown. For over 500 years, this has been one of the quiet engines running underneath British commerce, a tradition so old it predates most of the countries these companies now export to. It's not flashy. It's not a crown jewel glittering under museum lights. It's paperwork, applications, 5-year renewal cycles, and formal recognition from something called the Royal Household Warrants Committee. On its surface, it is about as unglamorous as royal life gets. Except it isn't unglamorous at all once you understand what it actually does to a business the moment it's granted. Only the reigning monarch decides who inside the family is even allowed to hand these out, and that decision has never been made lightly. Since Charles became king in 2022, that circle has been small, just him and Queen Camilla. He inherited around 159 warrants from his decades as Prince of Wales, warrants he'd first started building out as far back as 1980, and once he ascended the throne, he and Camilla began constructing an entirely new list from scratch. By the end of 2024, they'd granted well over 400 new warrants between them, on top of the hundreds already carried over. On average, the family grants around 30 new warrants a year, even as the total in circulation stays in the many hundreds, somewhere between 800 and 900 at any given time. This is not a ceremonial footnote sitting quietly in the background of royal life. This is one of the primary tools the monarchy uses to project which parts of British industry it wants standing next to it in public, decade after decade.
I'm so pleased to be joining you to launch the Taking Action on Addiction campaign. And I'm grateful to those of you who have shared your experiences of addiction with me here today.
And for the first time in over a century, that inner circle is expanding. Starting in spring 2026, William and Catherine can grant their own. Here's why that detail is so much bigger than a bureaucratic update. Every brand that's ever received a royal warrant will tell you, if you ask them plainly, that it changes everything about how the public and the industry perceive them overnight. It's not just a badge for the packaging. It's permission to put the royal arms on your product, your stationery, your vehicles, your storefront, your advertising, anywhere the company wants the public to see it. It's a signal to every customer walking past that this business has passed through the most exclusive vetting process in the country, one that requires a company to have supplied the household consistently for at least 5 of the past 7 years before they're even eligible to apply.
Into the future, while also journeying back to remember the past and learn from its lessons. We did this during the summer as we celebrated the 80th anniversaries of VE and VJ Day. The end of...
Companies chase this recognition for years, sometimes decades, supplying the royal household faithfully in near total anonymity, hoping that one day, someone with the authority to grant it finally decides they've earned it. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how far this reaches once a warrant is granted, because the list of companies currently holding one reads like a cross-section of British life itself, stretching far beyond anything you'd expect from a royal family's personal shopping list. Cartier holds one. So does Schweppes. So does Waitrose, the supermarket chain millions of ordinary British families shop at every week without a second thought to who else buys their groceries there. A small Cornish vineyard called Camel Valley holds one too, alongside centuries-old names like Gives and Hawkes, the tailoring house that's made military uniforms and formal wear for the family since 1789, and the Goring Hotel, a family-run establishment that quietly became the place where Catherine spent her final night before her own wedding. There's a jewelry firm on Bond Street that's held its warrant for generations, a champagne house that supplied royal celebrations for over a century, a flag maker whose banners have flown over state occasions most of the public never even notices are happening. None of these businesses are household names purely because of the warrant, but for every one of them, that small coat of arms on the label represents a relationship with the crown some of them have spent literal centuries building and protecting. It is, in a very real sense, one of the oldest continuously operating endorsement systems in the world, and it has survived wars, recessions, and the deaths of monarchs precisely because it has always stayed this quiet and this careful about who gets let in. Now there are 2 more people in Britain who can make that decision. And one of them is a woman whose personal effect on consumer behavior has already been given its own name. You've probably heard of the Kate effect even if you've never called it that. It's the well-documented, almost bizarre phenomenon where anything Catherine wears in public, a coat, a necklace, a pair of earrings from a small independent jeweler nobody had heard of the week before, sells out within hours, sometimes within minutes. It started back in 2010, before she was even married into the family, when a blue wrap dress she wore during her engagement interview vanished from shelves overnight and turned an otherwise unremarkable high street label into a household name almost by accident. It never stopped. 15 years later, jewelry designers, dressmakers, and small British labels still talk about a single appearance from Catherine the way other industries talk about landing a national television ad campaign. Except this one is free, unscheduled, and can happen at literally any public engagement she attends, with zero warning to the brand involved. It's not a one-time fluke either. Over the years, the same pattern has repeated itself so consistently that fashion analysts now track it the way financial analysts track market indices. A pair of earrings from a boutique designer, worn once at a garden party, can generate more overnight sales than that same designer's entire previous year of marketing. A coat from a mid-range British label, worn during a single school run caught by a single photographer, has been enough to sell out every size across every stockist within a day. It's happened with handbags, with Wellington boots, with children's clothing worn by her own kids, with entire jewelry collections that had sat quietly unnoticed for years before a single appearance turned them into the most searched item in the country. Industry insiders have been blunt about it for over a decade now. There is no marketing budget, no celebrity endorsement deal, no influencer partnership that moves product the way a single unplanned appearance by Catherine does, and the reason is simple. It isn't manufactured. Nobody is paying her, nobody is briefing her on what to wear for commercial reasons, and that authenticity is precisely what makes it so powerful. People don't feel sold to. They feel like they've caught a genuine glimpse of what she personally likes, and they want a piece of it. So picture what happens when that same woman is handed the formal, legal power to bestow the actual royal seal on a business. This isn't hypothetical influence anymore. This is codified, institutional authority layered directly on top of an already unmatched cultural and commercial force. Jewelers like Kiki McDonough, who Catherine has worn for years and who Camilla herself has since started wearing too, are already being talked about as likely candidates once applications open. Designers like Catherine Walker, Jenny Packham, and Alexander McQueen, the house that made her wedding dress and later her Coronation Day outfit, sit near the top of most insiders' shortlists, alongside labels she's worn quietly and consistently for over a decade, like Kiki McDonough for jewelry and Strathbury for handbags. Royal watchers have noted she may steer her early warrants away from fashion altogether, toward causes closer to her personal interests. The outdoors, early childhood development, gardening, rather than simply rewarding the designers who already benefit from her wearing them. Either way, this is Catherine's personal taste, personal history, and personal brand, now backed by the full legal weight of the crown. That's the practical side. That's what the warrant does in the real world, to real businesses, starting next year. But the deeper story, the one that actually explains why this moment feels different, isn't about marmalade jars or handbag brands at all. It's about who was allowed to hold this power before her, and more importantly, who wasn't. Because here's the detail that should stop you in your tracks. The last Princess of Wales to hold this authority was Queen Mary. In 1910. That is 115 years of silence on this specific power, passed over Princess Diana entirely. The most beloved, most photographed, most globally adored royal wife the modern monarchy has ever produced, and given, finally, to Catherine. Let that sit for a moment, because it's the real center of this story, and I promise you, once you understand why that gap exists, the timing of Catherine's warrant starts to look a lot less like routine modernization and a lot more like a deliberate decision made by a king who is thinking very carefully about what comes after him. Popularity and authority are not the same currency inside that palace, and history shows the family has often kept them deliberately separate, sometimes for generations at a time. Diana had the adoration of the entire world, arguably more of it than any royal before or since. What she never had, not officially, not on paper, was this particular lever of institutional control, the ability to formally decide, on the crown's behalf, which businesses were worthy of its endorsement. Whether that was about protecting the warrant system from becoming too closely tied to one increasingly independent, increasingly unpredictable personality in the final years of her marriage, or about a more calculated caution the establishment held toward a Princess of Wales it never fully trusted with unchecked influence, is something royal historians still debate today, decades on. What isn't up for debate is the outcome. 115 years passed since Queen Mary last held this power. Diana never received it. 2 more Princesses of Wales, in name only, came and went in the years since without the title carrying this authority at all, because there simply hasn't been another Princess of Wales in the interim to test it on. And then Catherine got the call that Diana never did. To put that gap in real perspective, think about everything that happened in this country and this family across those 115 years. 2 world wars came and went while this power sat dormant. The empire that once stretched across a quarter of the globe dissolved into the Commonwealth we know today. 6 monarchs sat on the throne. Television was invented, and then the internet, and then the smartphone, and still, through every single one of those changes, no Princess of Wales was handed this specific authority. Queen Mary granted her warrants in an era before radio broadcasting existed in British homes, a world so distant from ours that comparing it to today feels almost meaningless. And yet this is the precedent Catherine has now formally reactivated, more than a century later, in an age of instant global scrutiny Queen Mary could never have imagined. That's not a small historical footnote. That's the kind of gap that makes royal historians sit up and take notice, because institutions this old don't reactivate dormant precedents by accident. Every time this family revives something that sat untouched for generations, it's worth asking what, specifically, changed to make now the moment it finally happened. So why her, and why now? This is where the real facts of this year start lining up in a way that's hard to look away from, and I want to walk you through them carefully, one at a time, because none of what I'm about to lay out is rumor. This is what's actually been confirmed, piece by piece, over the past 2 years, through palace statements, medical broadcasts, and public appearances anyone can go back and verify. In February 2024, Buckingham Palace confirmed that King Charles had been diagnosed with cancer. The specific type was never disclosed to the public. Early reporting speculated it might be linked to a procedure he'd undergone for a benign enlarged prostate, since the diagnosis came to light during related testing, but the palace was clear that whatever the cancer actually was, it wasn't prostate cancer itself. Beyond that single clarification, the exact nature of his illness has remained undisclosed from that day to this one. Charles paused his public-facing duties for a period while treatment began, stepping back from the ceremonial calendar but continuing, by every account, with state business and the daily red boxes of government paperwork that never stop arriving regardless of a monarch's health. Within about 2 months, he was back in public, appearing at an Easter Sunday church service in March 2024, determined, by every account close to him, not to let his reign be defined by illness in its earliest years. For close to 2 years after that, he continued hosting state visits, greeting world leaders including a high-profile visit from President Trump in September, and carrying out the full ceremonial calendar of a working monarch, all while undergoing ongoing treatment that the palace kept carefully private, disclosed only in the broadest possible strokes whenever an update was given at all. Then in December 2025, Charles did something he rarely does. He addressed his own health directly, on camera, in a video message broadcast for the Stand Up to Cancer campaign. He said his treatment would be reduced heading into 2026, describing the milestone as a personal blessing and a testimony to the remarkable advances that have been made in cancer care in recent years, and adding that he hoped his experience might give encouragement to what he called the 50% of us who will be diagnosed with the illness at some point in our lives. He spoke about what he called the community of care surrounding every cancer patient, and about how early diagnosis, in his words, quite simply saves lives. A palace spokesperson followed up with more specific language, saying Charles had responded exceptionally well to treatment and that his care would now move into what they called a precautionary phase, continuously monitored, they said, to protect and prioritize his continued recovery. It's worth remembering just how unusual it was for Charles to address any of this personally at all. For most of his reign, health updates about the king have come through the careful, formal channel of a palace spokesperson, worded and reworded by communication staff before a single sentence reaches the public. A monarch speaking about his own cancer, in his own words, on camera, broadcast into homes across the country, is not something this family does casually. The last time the public saw anything close to this level of personal disclosure from a reigning monarch about serious illness was decades ago, and even then, it came filtered through statements rather than a direct address. So the choice to do this now, in December 2025, wrapped inside a charity broadcast rather than a dedicated health update, tells you something about how carefully this moment was managed. It was designed to feel personal and warm, tied to a cause bigger than himself, framed around hope and gratitude rather than clinical detail. And by every measure, it worked. Headlines the next morning focused on relief, on the word blessing, on the sense that the worst had passed. On the surface, that's good news. That's a king telling the country things are stabilizing, delivered in his own voice, on camera, in a moment clearly designed to reassure. And it may well be exactly that, nothing more and nothing less. But here's the piece that deserves real scrutiny, and it isn't a secret room or a midnight signature or anything invented for dramatic effect, it's simply this. The exact type of cancer Charles has battled since February 2024 has never been disclosed, not once, in close to 2.5 years. Not the type, not the stage, not a single specific clinical detail beyond the phrase responded exceptionally well and the careful language of a precautionary phase. For a public figure whose health has become a matter of genuine national interest, whose face is on the currency and whose well-being is tied directly to questions of succession, that is an extraordinary amount of silence to maintain for this long, and royal watchers, biographers, and journalists who cover this family closely have noticed it just as much as we have. One royal biographer, speaking publicly about the situation earlier this year, described Charles as the happiest he's ever been in his role despite the ongoing treatment, which is its own kind of telling detail, a king reportedly finding peace in the work itself, even as the underlying diagnosis stays locked behind palace doors. Whether that silence reflects nothing more than a family's right to medical privacy, a right most of us would want for ourselves in the same position, or something closer to careful institutional management of public perception during a delicate stretch for the monarchy, is something nobody outside that palace can answer with certainty. I want to be upfront with you here. Everything I'm about to connect together next is analysis and informed speculation built on real, confirmed facts, not confirmed palace reporting. So take it as exactly that, and weigh it accordingly. Because here's what else happened in that same stretch of time. While Charles was managing his own illness largely behind closed doors, Catherine was fighting, and surviving, a cancer battle of her own. One she chose to reveal to the public herself, on her own timeline, in her own words, in a manner strikingly different from how the palace has handled her father-in-law's diagnosis. And the way she came back from it is, I think, the real reason this warrant landed on her specifically, rather than simply passing to William and Camilla by default. Catherine's own health crisis became public not long after Charles's diagnosis, following a period of planned abdominal surgery in early 2024 that the palace initially described only in general terms. In the weeks and months that followed, she stepped back from royal duties for an extended stretch while the world speculated relentlessly about what was happening behind the walls of Kensington Palace, filling the silence with theories ranging from the mundane to the wildly conspiratorial. There were months where the simple absence of an obviously vibrant, camera-ready public figure became its own kind of story, one that arguably said more about the public's discomfort with royal silence than it did about anything actually happening inside that family. And then, quietly and without spectacle, she came back on her own terms, choosing when and how to speak about it rather than having the narrative dictated to her. By January 2025, she confirmed she had reached remission. Over the following year, she gradually increased her public workload, appearing at engagements, supporting causes close to her heart, and slowly, deliberately rebuilding the version of herself the public had grown used to seeing before everything changed. She marked her 44th birthday in January 2026 by releasing the final installment of a personal video series she calls Mother Nature. A quiet, reflective project she'd been building for years, this last chapter titled Winter and centered on what she described as its healing power, filmed with the kind of intimate, unhurried style that has become her signature whenever she chooses to speak directly to the public rather than through a palace statement. Just days later, on January 8th, she and William made their first joint appearance of the year, visiting NHS staff at Charing Cross Hospital, a deliberate, symbolic choice given everything both families had just been through with illness, and a quiet nod to the very healthcare system that had carried both her and her father-in-law through their respective treatments. Little by little, without ever making a spectacle of her own recovery the way a less careful public figure might have, Catherine rebuilt trust, rebuilt visibility, and rebuilt the public sense that she was back, fully, and here to stay for whatever comes next. What made that rebuilding so effective wasn't just the pace of it, it was the tone. She never leaned into sympathy the way public figures sometimes do after a health scare, never turned her recovery into a running storyline for the cameras to follow week by week. Instead, she chose a handful of deliberate moments to speak, on video, in her own voice, and let long stretches of ordinary, quiet public duty fill in the rest. That restraint became its own kind of statement. In an institution that has struggled for decades with how much of its private life to let the public see, Catherine found a middle path that satisfied both instincts at once, enough openness to keep the public invested and sympathetic, enough privacy to protect her family and her own sense of control over the story. Royal commentators have pointed to this balance repeatedly as one of the most skillfully handled personal crises in the modern era of this family, and it's not hard to see why a king managing his own far more secretive health situation might look at that approach with something close to admiration, or even see it as a model for how the institution itself should be handling difficult truths going forward. And there's one more thing Catherine has quietly done that almost nobody else in this family has managed, and it's worth pausing on because it explains so much of why Charles is willing to hand her institutional power most royals wait a lifetime for, if they ever receive it at all. She has an almost singular gift for making old, half-forgotten pieces of royal history feel alive again to a generation that has grown up scrolling past almost everything else the monarchy represents. Tiaras and jewelry that had sat quietly in storage for years, sometimes decades, barely remembered outside royal history circles and museum archives, have appeared on her at exactly the right cultural moment and instantly become the subject of conversation across an entirely new, younger audience that had never given the monarchy a second thought before. Royal historians and jewelry experts have pointed to this pattern for years now, describing it as something close to instinct. A rare ability to take pieces of a very old institution and make them feel current without ever cheapening them or turning them into a costume. That instinct is precisely the kind of thing that convinces a king thinking about the long-term survival of his institution that this is the person worth investing formal power in. Not because she asked for it. Not because she campaigned for visibility the way other royals occasionally have. But because, time and again, when she's given a platform, she uses it to make people care about a monarchy that a lot of younger audiences had quietly started to tune out entirely, treating it as background noise from another century rather than something relevant to their own lives. There's another layer to this worth mentioning before we move on, because it changes how we should read everything that's come before it. Camilla, as Queen, has held the power to grant warrants alongside Charles since 2024, and by most accounts the two of them have worked through that process together, jointly signing off on hundreds of new grants without any public sign of friction between them. That matters here because it tells us this expansion to William and Catherine wasn't framed, at least publicly, as taking anything away from Camilla or diminishing her role in any way. It was framed as an addition, a widening of the circle rather than a redistribution away from anyone already inside it. Whether that framing fully captures everything happening internally, or whether it's simply the version the palace chose to make public, is not something any of us outside the building can verify. But it's an important detail, because it means this story isn't really about anyone losing power. It's specifically about who gained it, and why, at this particular moment, out of everyone who could plausibly have received it next. One commentator who studies royal fashion and its commercial impact put it simply when the announcement first broke, bringing Catherine into this role gives the whole tradition a chance to feel new and relevant to a younger generation of royal watchers who never experienced it firsthand. That's a fair, measured read of the situation, and it's likely close to how the palace itself would want this framed if asked directly. But measured, official framing and the fuller picture underneath it aren't always the same thing, and that's exactly the gap we're about to walk into. If you've made it this far, I think you already sense where this is heading, and I want to say clearly. This next section is where the pieces really start to connect, So if you're finding this useful, now's the moment to subscribe, because what comes next is the part of this story that most coverage of the warrant announcement completely missed. So now let's lay the real pieces of 2024, 2025, and 2026 next to each other, plainly, in the order they actually happened, and let you draw your own conclusions, because I think the pattern speaks for itself once you see it laid out chronologically rather than scattered across a dozen separate headlines. Charles is diagnosed with cancer in February 2024. Catherine reveals her own cancer diagnosis shortly after, in that same year, following her own surgery. Both undergo treatment largely behind closed doors. Both eventually return to public duties, determined not to let illness define their public image in the early years of a new reign that was already facing enough scrutiny without a health crisis attached to it. In June 2025, with both of their health battles now part of the public record and both apparently stabilizing, the palace confirms William and Catherine will become grantors of royal warrants. A power withheld from every princess of Wales, including Diana, for over 100 years. Months later, in December 2025, Charles goes on camera to tell the country his own treatment is being scaled back, calling it a personal blessing, while his exact diagnosis remains as undisclosed as it's ever been, over 2 years on from the original announcement. And running underneath all of it, in the same window of time, Catherine spends those months quietly proving, appearance by appearance, video series by video series, tiara by tiara, that she is the one member of this family capable of making the institution feel relevant to people who might otherwise have stopped watching entirely. None of that, taken piece by piece, is unusual for a working monarchy managing succession over a period of years. Royal families plan ahead, often decades in advance. Powers shift generationally, quietly, through exactly this kind of incremental process. That's normal, and there's a very reasonable, uncontroversial explanation sitting right there in plain sight. A king easing into a longer-term arrangement with the next generation while his own health stabilizes and his confidence in the future of the institution grows, and rewarding the daughter-in-law who has proven, again and again, that she can carry public trust in a way almost nobody else in this family currently can, Camilla included. That is very likely exactly what this is, and I want to be honest with you that it's the simplest, best supported explanation of everything we've laid out today. But it's also fair to ask the question a lot of royal watchers have started asking quietly this year, and I'll pose it to you the same way, clearly labeled as the speculation it is and nothing more. Is the timing here simply years of careful succession planning finally becoming visible all at once, the natural endpoint of a plan that's been quietly underway since Charles's coronation? Or is a king who has never disclosed the exact nature of his illness, and who has just told the country his treatment is easing at the same moment he hands his daughter-in-law a 115-year dormant power, quietly building the version of the monarchy he once left behind, sooner rather than later, while he still has the chance to shape it himself? Nobody outside that palace knows the answer to that question with any certainty, and anyone who tells you they do is guessing, no matter how confidently they say it. What we can say is that the pattern is real, the facts behind it are all independently confirmed and publicly documented, and the question is one worth sitting with rather than dismissing outright as coincidence, and worth revisiting rather than accepting as fully settled simply because the palace hasn't chosen to address it directly. If this is the kind of story that keeps you thinking well after the video ends, if you find yourself going back over the timeline in your head trying to decide which explanation you actually believe, that's exactly the reaction this channel is built around, so if you haven't already, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because there's more of this pattern still unfolding and I don't think we've seen the last piece of it yet. Let's talk about what this could actually mean going forward, because a warrant is never really about warrants. It's about trust, and trust inside a monarchy is the one currency that determines everything else. Who gets access? Who gets visibility, who eventually gets handed the responsibilities that come with real power rather than symbolic power, and who, ultimately, the institution decides to build its future around when the moment finally comes to make the decision plainly rather than through careful, incremental steps. Consider what Catherine is now positioned to become, practically speaking, over the next several years. She isn't just a working royal anymore, showing up to ribbon cuttings and hospital visits and smiling for the cameras before moving on to the next engagement. she's now one of a small handful of people in the entire country with the legal authority to formally recognize which British businesses deserve the Crown's endorsement, an authority that took her husband decades of waiting as heir to receive alongside her, and one that skipped his own mother entirely. Combine that with the commercial force she already carries into every single public appearance, and you have someone whose approval alone can meaningfully shift the fortunes of a small British jeweler, a heritage clothing brand, a family-run food producer that supplied the household quietly for generations without ever once being publicly recognized for it. That is not a small thing to hand someone. That is a genuine transfer of institutional weight, and it's happening at the exact moment the family's health situation is most uncertain and most closely watched by a public that has grown increasingly used to reading between the lines of every palace statement. Think, too, about what this means for how the public will experience the monarchy over the coming years, in ways that go beyond any single business or brand. Every time Catherine grants a warrant, it will be reported. Every recipient will be announced, celebrated, written up in trade press and picked up by the same royal correspondents who cover every other movement this family makes. That means Catherine's personal taste, her personal causes, the small British businesses she chooses to elevate, will become a recurring, structural part of how the public engages with the monarchy going forward, not just an occasional headline when she wears something nice to an event. It builds a rhythm, a drumbeat of visibility that didn't exist for her in this form before, and it hands her a permanent, ongoing role in shaping public perception of what this institution values and who it chooses to celebrate. That is a very different kind of influence than simply being popular. It's structural. It's built into the calendar now, year after year, for as long as she holds the title. There's also the question of what this signals to the wider British public about where the monarchy is putting its confidence for the next chapter, whenever that chapter formally arrives, and about how the institution wants to be perceived while it waits for that chapter to begin. Institutions like this one don't often move quickly, and they almost never move without carefully calculating the message a decision sends, both to the public and to the family itself. Handing Catherine a power Diana never received, at a moment when Charles's own health remains an open question the public isn't allowed to fully see behind, sends a message whether the palace intended it loudly or not, whether it was designed as pure symbolism or arrived at through nothing more dramatic than ordinary administrative planning. It tells the country, and frankly it tells the rest of the family too, exactly who Charles believes is capable of carrying the emotional and cultural weight of this institution forward into whatever comes next. Not William alone, despite his position as heir. Not Camilla, despite her status as queen. Catherine, specifically, given a form of authority the family has kept locked away from every Princess of Wales for over a century, right as its own leadership faces the most uncertain stretch it's had in years. Royal historians who study these patterns will tell you that succession planning inside this family rarely announces itself directly, rarely arrives with a headline that says plainly what's actually happening. It moves in small administrative steps that only make sense in hindsight, years later, once you can look back and see the full shape of what was actually being built the whole time, one quiet decision layered on top of the last. A warrant here. A joint hospital visit there. A health update carefully worded to sound reassuring without ever actually confirming what's being reassured or what exactly the reassurance is protecting the public from worrying about. Individually, none of these moments look like much, and any single one of them, taken in isolation, would barely register as news at all. Stacked together, in this order, in this shorter window of time, they start to look less like coincidence and more like the outline of a plan Charles has been quietly assembling piece by piece, in full view of the public, without ever once explaining what the full picture actually is or intends to become. Consider how differently this all would read if these events had been spread across 20 years instead of 2. A health scare in one decade, a warrant expansion in another, a joint hospital visit sometime after that, each so far apart that no reasonable person would ever think to connect them. That's how most royal succession planning actually unfolds, stretched out so gradually that it never feels like planning at all, just the slow, natural drift of one generation making room for the next. What makes this particular stretch of time different, and what's made royal watchers sit up and take notice in a way they haven't in years, is the compression. 2 cancer diagnoses in the same family within months of each other. A dormant, 115-year-old power reactivated less than 18 months later. a televised health update calling treatment reduction a personal blessing, arriving within another 6 months of that. This isn't a plan unfolding across a generation. If it's a plan at all, it's one unfolding across roughly 2 years, and that pace alone is enough to explain why this story has generated the kind of attention that a routine warrant announcement never would have on its own. We don't know yet whether Catherine's new authority is the beginning of a much larger transfer of responsibility, a first visible step in something bigger still working its way through the palace's own internal planning, or simply one more milestone in a long, ordinary process of a modern monarchy modernizing itself generation by generation, exactly the way every monarchy before it has had to. What we do know is that the pattern is real, the timing is genuinely unusual by the standards of this family's own history, and the question of what comes next for Catherine, and for the institution she's now more formally tied to than any Princess of Wales in living memory, is nowhere close to settled, no matter how the palace chooses to frame it in whatever comes next. So here's the real question this story leaves us with, and it's the one worth sitting with long after this video ends. This was never really about marmalade jars or jewelry brands or a 5-year renewal cycle buried in royal household paperwork nobody outside the industry ever reads. It was always about trust, about who a king facing his own uncertain future chooses to hand real institutional power to, and about what that choice quietly tells us regarding how much longer this particular chapter of the monarchy has left to run, and what shape the next one is already quietly taking. Catherine has spent the last 2 years fighting her way back from her own illness, rebuilding public trust piece by piece in full view of a public that watched every step of it, and proving, again and again, that she can make a 100-year-old institution feel alive to people who had almost stopped paying attention to it entirely. Now she holds a form of authority that skipped an entire generation of royal wives to get to her, one that Diana, for all her global adoration, never once held. Whatever comes next for this family, it's very hard to imagine it happening without Catherine standing closer to the center of it than any Princess of Wales has stood in over a century. It's worth remembering, too, that this family has been here before, in different forms, at different moments of transition. Every generational handover in this institution's history has come with its own quiet signals, its own small administrative decisions that only made sense in hindsight once historians could look back with the full picture in view. What made the transition from Queen Elizabeth to Charles feel so seamless, at least on the surface, was decades of exactly this kind of preparation, doled out slowly enough that the public barely noticed it happening until it was already complete. If Charles is doing the same thing now, laying groundwork carefully and quietly for whatever comes after his own reign, then a warrant granted to Catherine in the summer of 2025 might look, 10 years from now, like the moment historians point to as the real beginning of the next chapter, the first visible thread in a pattern that took years to fully reveal itself. Or it might not be that at all. It might simply be a king, recovering from a frightening diagnosis, watching his daughter-in-law do the same, and deciding that the woman who fought her way back deserves to be trusted with more, plainly and simply, without any grander design behind it. Both readings are honest. Both are supported by everything we actually know. And until this family chooses to tell us more than they have, which historically, they rarely do until long after the moments that matter have already passed, the rest of us are left exactly where royal watchers always end up, piecing together small, quiet decisions and trying to guess at the larger shape they're building toward. What we do know, without any speculation attached to it at all, is this. Catherine now holds a form of institutional trust that outlasted Diana, outlasted 2 generations of royal wives who came after her, and sat dormant for over a century before landing, finally, in her hands. However this story continues to unfold, whatever comes next for Charles's health, for William's future reign, for the shape this monarchy eventually takes, Catherine is no longer just a Princess of Wales admired from a distance. She is now formally, legally, institutionally part of how this crown decides what it stands for in public. That's not a small thing to have earned, and it's not a small thing for a king to have handed over. If you want to be here when the next piece of this story breaks, make sure you're subscribed, because this is far from the last update coming out of that palace, and I don't think it will be the last time we're asking exactly this question about exactly this family. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.